Preparation for David's lesson this morning, I'll be reading from Philippians 4, 1 through 3. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, you whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way. Dear friends, I plead that Euodia, and I plead that, I trust you. I should have read this before I came up here. To be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, my true companion, help these women, since they have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Brother Dave.
Thanks, David. You may be seated. I, of course, am very happy to have Diana back with me and also to have Abby and Zach here for the week, so God is good indeed. God is good indeed. I want to start with an old poem that I've liked over the years. It's a good one. It's called The Perfect Church. I think that I shall never see a church that's all it ought to be. A church whose members never stray beyond the straight and narrow way. A church that has no empty pews, whose preacher never has the blues. A church whose deacons always deek, and none is proud and all are meek. Where gossips never peddle lies or make complaints or criticize. Where all are always sweet and kind, and all to others' faults are blind. Such perfect churches there may be, but none of them are known to me. But still, we'll work and pray and plan to make our own the best we can. Because churches are made up of imperfect human beings, there is no such thing, there's never been, never will be a perfect church. We might think that in the New Testament times that surely those first churches, surely they were perfect churches, right? I mean, after all, those people had been with Jesus. Some of them knew him, right? Some of them had been with the apostles. They'd seen the miracles. Surely they were perfect churches, right? Wrong. When we read the letters of Paul and Peter and John in the New Testament, we begin to see that the early church, those early Christians, faced the same kind of temptations and struggles, problems and failures that all of us face. The important thing for those early churches and for our churches today is to properly work through the problems that we have in our churches with the wisdom and the power of God. See, it's God's will for churches to strive towards unity because it's vital to the health of the church. It's vital to the growth of the church. Nothing will destroy a church and its mission quite like internal division. So my aim today is to challenge us, number one, but also hopefully enable us to be able to work in harmony with one another. So let's take our lesson right from the Apostle Paul's example of how he addressed a problem that was taking place in the church there at Philippi. So let's start by looking at the problem. So our text for today begins with these words. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, that is how you should stand firm in the Lord, dear friends. And so there's no doubt how Paul really felt about the church at Philippi, right? They are his joy. They are his crown. They're his dear friends and brothers and sisters. He loves them and longs for them. Can anyone talk more affectionately about anybody than that? It's truly beautiful. I find it interesting and instructive to note that Paul is careful to communicate his love for others, especially when he's just about to correct them. You know, that helps to keep things in perspective, right? When we need to say something that might be hard to hear, to clarify the perspective by, keep this in mind, right? We might say, I need to say something that may be difficult for you to hear, but please remember, I love you, and I want the best for you. So I don't say this to hurt you, but to help you. So Paul's statement, that's how you should stand firm in the Lord, dear friends, certainly looks to the verses preceding this. In that section that we've been looking at for a while, strive towards the heavenly prize and keep your minds in your heavenly citizenship. So standing firm surely has to do with that, but it also looks forward to the section he's about to go into. about how to get along and about how to rejoice in the Lord always and how to not worry but pray and things like that. And so with that verse as an introduction and foundation, Paul then addressed the problem directly. In verse 2 he writes, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to agree with each other in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, loyal yokefellow, help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. Now what's amazing to me is we know nothing more about the situation going on there at Philippi than what we have right here in these verses. From this verse we learn there were two women there at Philippi, and Paul calls them out by name, Euodia and Syntyche. These are traditional female names in that day and time. And they were at odds with each other. Now, we don't know what the disagreement was about, but it must have been significant. It must have had far-reaching consequences. Otherwise, Paul would certainly not address it so publicly, right? So who are these women who are struggling to get along with each other? Perhaps they were among the original group of women who became Christians when Paul first went there on that missionary journey in Acts chapter 16. And he went by the riverside, and there was Lydia and some other women. Maybe those women included Euodia and Syntyche. Maybe they were women who were having the church meet in their home. That's a possibility, right? They were certainly women who were important to the work at Philippi. Paul described them as having contended at his side for the cause of the gospel. These women were all in, and they were working hard for godly things. But that's all we know about these women in the situation. It seems like a good place to stop and to draw an important lesson for application. It's sad for me to know that all we know about Euodia and Syntyche is that they were two women who had a disagreement. I'm sure there were a lot more to these two women than just this one matter. And yet they go down in history for what? For being these two women who had to be called out by the Apostle Paul to get along with each other. Makes a person think, doesn't it? How do you want to be remembered, right? How do you want your spiritual life summarized? What do you want to be remembered for? And I think we'd all say we want to be remembered for positive things, right? We want people to say, oh, you know, he or she, man, they loved just like Jesus loved. Wouldn't you like to be remembered for that, right? Or he or she, man, they brought so many people to Jesus. It's amazing. Or he and she were so gracious and giving and understanding and kind or whatever. We want to be known for those kind of things. We don't want to be remembered for negative things like, well, they were just a pew potato, sat around, didn't get involved in the church at all, and just criticized about everything. We don't want to go down in history as that kind of person. Certainly we don't want to go down in history as the guy or gal who split the church. Sadly, these ladies went down in history in more of a negative light than a positive one. So that's what little we know about the problem, but let's see about the solution that Paul suggests. Notice again the verses we've already read. Let's look again at verses 2 and 3. I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche to agree with each other in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you, loyal yokefellow, help these women who have contended at my side in the cause of the gospel. So we notice Paul's first charge was to the women themselves, that they settle the problem in the Lord. He addresses them each equally. Did you notice that? I plead with Euodia, and I plead with Syntyche. He doesn't take sides. He doesn't indicate who's right or wrong. You say, why did he choose Euodia first? Well, maybe he's doing it alphabetically. That's what I do to try to stay out of trouble, right? Just go with the alphabetical order. All right? Charles Swindoll wrote this. He said, when disharmony arises between two people or two groups, there is some measure of fault on both sides. Both parties must be encouraged to see each other's faults and each other's failure and to meet on common ground with mutual willingness to listen and change. But we notice how strong that word is that Paul used. I plead. You hear the urgency, the intensity. You know, it's always best for two people who have a problem between the two of them to simply go to each other directly to try to resolve it, right? What do we tend to do? We tend to go to everybody else about the problem, right? Rather than go to the person with whom we have the problem. In Jesus' teaching, he gave us a formula for addressing interpersonal problems there in Matthew 18:15. If your brother sins against you, go, show him his fault just between the two of you. And if he listens to you, you've won a brother over. But if he won't, then Jesus said, take along somebody else and try to get some help. But start with just the two of you, between the two of you. And maybe these two ladies at Philippi had tried to do that. Maybe they had, I don't know. Why is it that we don't often go directly to the person that we're having a problem with? Is it because we're just afraid of conflict and confrontation in general? Many of us are in that category, right? Just don't want to have to deal with it, right? Is it because we're afraid of making matters worse? Completely blowing up the relationship? I've been there before. Is it because we don't know what to say or how to say it? That's often part of it, right? But these fears or these deficits are something that God can help us deal with because He wants things resolved. He wants things worked out. He wants people to get along. So He can help us deal with our fears and our deficits. Employing the fruit of the Spirit will make a big difference, right? Approaching the person with love, humility, gentleness, all those good fruits of the Spirit. We notice also that Paul charges the women to agree in the Lord. Our mutual commitment and obedience to the Lord can bring unity in the midst of diversity and in the midst of disagreement. We may not be able to agree with everybody about everything, and that's the case. We're all so different, and we think different about different things. We have different likes and all that kind of stuff, right? So we're not charged to agree with each other about everything, but we are charged to agree with each other in the Lord and in the most important things about the Lord. So if we both love the Lord and His church more than we love ourselves, then many of the things that cause disagreement become less important. The original apostles that Jesus brought together were very different, right? Even natural enemies of each other, and yet because of their allegiance to Christ, they were able to get along with each other. And so with the right attitude and with God's help, all of us can get along in the Lord. Paul's second charge, though, beyond the charge to those two women, was to the congregation. Help these two women get along. Excuse me. Now, there's been some speculation amongst the commentators as to who Paul's talking about when he talks about the loyal yoke fellow. Who is this, right? Is he referring to a specific anonymous member? Is he referring to the whole congregation? Is he addressing someone? And actually, this is the person's name. The English translators have translated as loyal yokefellow, but that was, somebody's name. And that name in Greek would be Sitsingus. Hey, brother Sitsingus, can you take care of the problem? Well, some commentators, of course, suggest he's appealing to the entire congregation in general, all the loyal yokefellow. But unless the congregation, held a congregational meeting and had some kind of intervention, it's kind of hard for everybody to be involved in a problem like this, right? You don't always want everybody involved in an interpersonal problem. My guess is he's referring to a specific individual. Probably not somebody by that name. Probably keeping their name somewhat hidden in general. Perhaps it's even Epaphroditus, Paul's co-worker, who is the bearer of this letter. That would make sense, wouldn't it? So if Epaphroditus and Paul have heard about this problem, Paul writes the letter, sends it with Epaphroditus and says to Epaphroditus, now listen, I'm gonna say that the loyal yoke fellow, and that's you, are to help these ladies work this out. And here's what I want you to do when you get there. So perhaps that's really what was going on. Nevertheless, whomever Paul had in mind, the point was someone needed to help these two resolve their difficulty. And sometimes the situation between two people gets so hurtful and so emotionally charged that some other neutral individual does need to be a mediator, right? To help each of them to see each other's points of view and to get over the hump of the challenge. Now, a good question for us to explore at this point is, how can we help others resolve their differences? And first of all, I would suggest we must not become part of the problem. And sometimes that's what happens, right? We get sucked in and we become part of the problem. We might become part of the problem when we listen to and spread rumors, when we jump to conclusions, when we take sides in the disagreement. If someone wants to talk with us about a problem they're having with someone else, we should be very careful about getting involved. We might want to start by asking them some questions like, why do you want to tell me about this? Then we might ask, so who have you already talked to about this? Why am I number 100? Right? And of course, an important question is, have you already first tried to talk with the person you're having the conflict with? And if not, why not? And if they haven't because they don't feel like they can or that it'll be productive, then you could offer to go along with them. But you might say, but I don't want to hear about the situation until we meet together so that I can hear both sides of this thing without having any prejudice from the start. I love the proverb, Proverbs 18:17, that says, the first person to present his case seems right till another comes forward and questions him. How many times have you heard one side of the story and you're outraged, right? And then you hear the other side of the story and it's like, whoa, okay, wait just a minute. You didn't exactly tell the whole story. And so that's important. Don't become part of the problem. That's the first thing. A second thing I would suggest is try to help the two people get a spiritual perspective. Often when we're in conflict, we've lost perspective, right? We're so tied into how hurt we are about the situation, how wronged we've been about the situation, that we've forgotten the most important things. I like the story took place during a battle that the British were involved in with the French. And Lord Nelson discovered two of his top officers were not on speaking terms with each other. He called those two officers to the deck of that ship, and he pointed over to the French fleet and he said, there's the enemy. You two shake hands and be friends. You guys aren't the enemy. There's the enemy. Let's keep that in perspective, right? So we Christians need the same thing. We find ourselves in conflict with a fellow soldier of Christ, and we forget who's the real enemy. It's not our brother or sister. It's Satan and his cohorts, right? So sometimes we need to be reminded about the spiritual perspective, reminded about who the real enemy is, reminded of who the real master and Lord is. That's not me or you, right? That's Jesus. We need to be reminded how often we have needed God's mercy. So maybe you are the wronged person and that other person needs to be forgiven. Or maybe it's vice versa. We may need to be reminded that real love puts the needs of others ahead of our own. When Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, you remember what he talked about in chapter 2? Remember how those first 11 verses are all about have the same love and the same mind and put others' needs ahead of your own. And then he gives the example of Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God, but he humbled himself and became obedient. He became our servant. You think that was just a nice thing that Paul just wanted to throw out there? Or do you think it had to do some with this situation? A direct application for these ladies, right? So can you imagine how Euodia and Syntyche might have been feeling that day when Epaphroditus showed up with a letter? I have a letter from Paul. Woo! How exciting is this? And he's reading it along, how much Paul loves them, how he's confident God's going to do great things among them. He gets to chapter 2 and about how they need to get along with each other and follow the example of Jesus. And Euodia is sitting there thinking, I sure hope Syntyche's listening to this. And Syntyche's sitting there thinking, I sure hope Euodia's listening to this. How often do we do that when we read our Bibles, right? Boy, that applies to them. And then Epaphroditus gets to chapter 4. And he mentions their names. Then they must have realized how this letter applied to them. And see, these verses put into the right perspective of what we need to do and how we need to get along with others. And that's the kind of help sometimes people need. They just can't see it themselves, but they need someone to help them see it. And then number 3, as we seek to help others resolve their differences, let's be very humble and gentle and careful of ourselves, right? Paul shared these insightful words with the Galatian churches. Brothers and sisters, if someone is caught in a sin, you who are spiritual should restore him gently. But watch yourself, or you also may be tempted. As we seek to be helpful to others, we have to be careful to remind ourselves and others that we are not perfect either, and that we have to be careful ourselves. We're not being judgmental or condescending. We're fellow sinners. We must not let down our guard or somehow be drawn into sin. We are called to be ambassadors of reconciliation, but it's not an easy role to play. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God." And how awesome is that? We most appear, obviously, to be God's kids when we are peacemaking, because God's a peacemaker. So, as we bring the sermon to a close, let me suggest that we should not be surprised when conflict occurs in the church. We should not be surprised by, I thought the church was going to be perfect, and now I'm so disappointed. Even good churches can have conflict. Even good Christians, even good leaders can have conflict. Case in point, Paul and Barnabas, great missionaries. They couldn't decide to go forward together in a disagreement about Mark. Two great Christians still had some trouble at times to get along with each other. Now, there are many reasons why churches and Christians might end up in conflict. Sometimes the issues are important and involve important spiritual matters. And in those cases, there needs to be conflict as we try to figure out what God's will is. But most of the time, the turmoil is over petty and insignificant things, like the time when the church should meet. We presently have the early service and the late service. But if by some chance we decided we were only going to have one service permanently, can you imagine how we might have a little disagreement over what time that should be? Well, it definitely should be at 8:30 in the morning, shouldn't it? Right? I mean, that's the best time, right? I'm guessing the 11 o'clockers would probably like it to be at 11, right? That's why we're meeting at Get Air at 10, right? Yeah, okay. So, we must keep in mind that Satan and his demons use many different tools in their attempts to destroy Christians. Conflict is one of the favorite tools, right? Satan's got this big old wrench, and he just loves to say, let me just throw this wrench in there, right? Let me see what this wrench will do to that relationship. Let me see what this wrench will do to that church. And he throws it in there, and it gets caught in all the gears and creates all kinds of problems. He loves it. So when conflicts arise, we must realize that we're under attack from the evil one, and we must resolve to not let Satan win. I want to end with the words of the good old Beatles song, released in 1965. Might have some Beatle lovers and some fans here this morning. We can work it out. Although some of the lyrics don't apply perfectly, but a lot of them have some pretty powerful truths. And if you're a Beatles fan and you know their history, you might wish they had listened to their own lyrics. Try to see it my way. Do I have to keep on talking till I can't go on? While you see it your way, run the risk of knowing that our love may soon be gone. We can work it out. We can work it out. Think of what you're saying. You can get it wrong and still you think it's all right. Think of what I'm saying. We can work it out and get it straight. Or say goodnight. We can work it out. We can work it out. And then the chorus is so great. Life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friend. Boy, isn't that true? Life is just too short to spend it fussing and fighting. I've always thought that it's a crime. So I'll ask you once again, try to see it my way. Only time will tell if I'm right or wrong. I'm probably wrong. While you see it your way, there's a chance we might fall apart. Before too long, we can work it out. We can work it out. As long as we're only seeing things our way, it's likely we're not going to be able to resolve the conflict. We must try to see things from other people's perspectives. And obviously, most importantly, we better see it from God's perspective if we want to get it right. But the favorite truth in the song to me is life is very short. Very short. There is no time for fussing and fighting. Especially to stay in conflict with people we're likely going to spend eternity with. That doesn't make much sense, does it? And so with God's mind and God's help, we can work it out. Yeah. Well, I hope this is an encouraging and helpful lesson for all of us, because we're all going to find ourselves in conflict, maybe before the day is over.